Hi, my name is Lisa Pugh, and I am working with the Advocacy Institute to help states through their process in the Every Student Succeeds Act stakeholder process. And I'm participating as a representative from the disability community. I work for our state's Protection and Advocacy Agency, and I was appointed to our state superintendent's Equity in Every Student Succeeds Act Stakeholder Council. So in your state, you very likely have a similar stakeholder process. You may or may not have a council like ours, but it's certainly something to investigate and see what the process is and how you can participate. I'll give you an outline of what happened in our second meeting. I did a previous summary of the first meeting, and so our second meeting was held on September 27th, and we're going to have a total of 6 meetings. And that council, as I mentioned previously, includes a variety of different types of stakeholders for different populations of students from all across the state. And I'm perhaps the only representative that's talking specifically on behalf of students with disabilities and their family members. So as I mentioned, this was our second meeting, and our charge of this meeting was to discuss what's called that fifth indicator. So it's a new indicator that states very likely have not been collecting data on. And I'll share with you more about how we approach that discussion. Our overall charge is equity, figuring out how an accountability system really addresses all populations of students. So we started out talking a little bit more about Wisconsin's changing demographics. So again, I think this is important to know kind of what are the characteristics of students in your state, and are there geographic pockets that need different types of attention. So we were talking about how our state is just 12% people of color, but our student population is 28% children of color. So that is representing a pretty significant shift in Wisconsin population, and certainly something to pay attention to as we design an equitable accountability system that meets the needs of all students. We talked a little bit about achievement gaps in certain minority subgroups and how we needed to keep that in mind when we were discussing this fifth indicator. Unfortunately, in that discussion, it was not discussed by our state education agency regarding the significant achievement gaps for students with disabilities. Just another reminder how oftentimes our subgroup of students, which in Wisconsin is between 12 and 15% of the student population, really is just kind of not considered a priority, unfortunately. They're part of the discussion, but that significant achievement gap seems like we always need to raise that question. We talked about the timeline for this process, which is the same for all states. Our state did not choose to ask for early plan approval. That is an option for states. Our state to the south, our neighboring state to the south, Illinois, was an early plan approval state. We were told we did not choose to go that route because of all of the necessary stakeholder input process, but also the fact that the final ESSA regulations are not out yet. They're just in proposed form and really not expected to be available until December. So we made the decision as a state to wait for those final regulations before submitting our final plan, rather than going through revisions that might not be in alignment with the final regulation. Again, we talked about how there's some timelines. There will be a 30-day public review of the plan, and then our governor gets a 30-day review, and then we expect to submit by June. So that might be something you want to check out in your state. What's the timeline? Are you an early plan submission state? And if so, where are you at in the process? And then what do they expect the stakeholder input processes to look like, and how can you get involved? Then we really talked about what's the state of our current accountability system. So every state under federal law has to have some sort of a system in place currently, and now what we're doing is changing it to align with the new law. So we kind of talked about how in Wisconsin, our accountability system is currently made up of what we pulled together for the old ESSA accountability waiver. We, like many states, had a waiver in place. And then we also have some provisions in state law that comprise our state report cards or our school district report cards. And those, the current accountability report cards have multiple indicators across 4 priority areas that are student achievement, student growth, closing gaps, and on-track post-secondary readiness. And then we also have measures around performance on 3 student engagement indicators that are reported, and those are test participation rate, absenteeism, and dropout rate. And then that accountability puts schools into 5 different accountability rating categories: significantly exceeds expectations, meets expectations, meets few expectations, and fails to meet expectations. So it's really important for states to keep in mind kind of what is the state of the state in terms of their current accountability system, and what does ESSA require them to change, and really focus on those elements, because what you don't want is 2 separate systems. You want schools and districts to be able to report in alignment with what they already are required to report, so we aren't increasing burden where we don't have to. We then moved into the discussion of new indicators that we have to include in ESSA. What will be new for districts and for the state? So we talked about this 5th indicator, and it's at least one that's under ESSA. We're requiring the system to include for a state at least one indicator of school quality or student success, referred to as the 5th indicator, and it may include student engagement, educator engagement, student access to and completion of advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, school climate and safety, and any other indicator that the state chooses that meets the requirements. So that's kind of the framework in the statute that we're working with. The proposed federal regulation in this area is not final yet, but the regulation currently says that the indicator must be valid and reliable and comparable across all LEAs, and must be able to be disaggregated by subgroups of students. So that's kind of the when we're talking about what kind of data we measure and the quality of it, we're going to have those elements in place, at least according to the proposed regulation. So then our group, our Stakeholder Council, moved into discussion on 3 different areas, and we talked about how to measure college and career readiness, how to measure student engagement, and how to measure school climate and safety. Now, those were not, those aren't, we could have chosen to discuss different areas, but that was what our SEA put in front of us in terms of what they wanted to get out of the Stakeholder Council. We talked about how measuring college and career readiness is a little bit easier. There's already an evidence base around what it takes to support students to be college and career ready. There's some data out there. I think the tricky part for students with disabilities, and I'll get into that, is that we don't always have good measures for how students with disabilities are able to access some of these college preparatory or career readiness sorts of tests or data collection pieces. On engagement and school safety, we talked about how that really is new territory for states and for school districts, that we don't necessarily have a lot of good measures. We don't know what to measure. A lot of this information is collected through satisfaction type surveys. And is that valid, and how is it collected currently, and how can it be collected to a greater degree at the school level, was kind of what we talked about. We don't currently have anything in our Wisconsin accountability system around engagement and school safety. So that's really where we spent a lot of our time, and might be where you would spend a lot of your time in your state. Before we kind of dove into those 3 areas, we were asked to think about both measures, like what data would be included, and then the metrics. How would this particular measure be included within the overall accountability system that ultimately would end up giving a school or a district some sort of a grade? And then we were asked to consider the impact of the shift of demographics that we talked about earlier, and how that might impact what sort of measure we would choose. So kind of moving on into those 3 areas, in college and career readiness, I'm just going to give you a sense for the sort of input that I provided. People talked about advanced coursework as a college and career readiness measure. I brought up the point that it's really important to understand access and the limitations to access for students with disabilities. So we know that sometimes students with IEPs are told that they simply can't take AP courses or other advanced courses. So if that's going to be used as a measure, there needs to be some communication and understanding of the degree to which students with disabilities actually are accessing advanced coursework now. That's something that the Office of Civil Rights has weighed in on in a Dear Colleague letter in 2007. So we want to know that if that's considered a main measure on college and career readiness. We talked about post-secondary readiness metrics, that the FAFSA, the student aid measure or application, is a poor measure of that. It doesn't have anything to do with readiness. We did talk about remedial education as a more accurate assessment of post-secondary readiness and particularly impacts students with disabilities. How many students with disabilities are going on to technical colleges or college where they're spending a good deal of their first credits and coursework in remedial classes upon entry to that school? And we do collect data on that, so we think that would be a pretty strong measure of how we're preparing those students for post-secondary education. Post-secondary enrollment. I made the point that it's important to measure persistence. If a student with a disability actually continues to attend 1 and 2 years later, it's not just about enrollment. We know many students with disabilities, often students who are forced into remedial education, often drop out. Workforce readiness, we want to know if they're employed 1 year after graduation. And the good thing for students with disabilities is we obviously already collect this under IDEA in Indicator 14, which tells us 1 year upon exiting school, if that student with a disability is working in competitive employment or otherwise enrolled in post-secondary education. And that information is even disaggregated by disability type. So that's a pretty good measure for students with disabilities. So it's definitely something that I brought up that could help to give us that sort of information, and frankly is the level of information we probably want about all students. We talked about how, community readiness or civic engagement is really important, but there's not a great way to measure it. But that perhaps a student survey could be something that could collect that sort of information. I also talked about for students that this category of college and career readiness really should be measured in 2 separate areas, that we should be looking at post-secondary success and workforce readiness separately. They should not be folded together, and that this community readiness measure should be added. On the student engagement question, I made the strong case that student suspension and expulsion data really should be part of this. We have suspension rates for Wisconsin Black students with disabilities that is 48%. It's the highest in the nation. And when you're talking about student engagement, how can you be engaged when you're not even in class? And so there was quite a discussion about whether or not these sort of disciplinary measures should be included in some disagreement, but I think I'll continue to make the case that this is a really important measure of student engagement and really impacts that and has that achievement gap for students with disabilities and other subgroups. And so if we're going to make movement in that achievement gap, this is something that should be on the table. So we'll see where we get with that. But I'd urge you to look at your own, suspension and expulsion data for students with disabilities and bring that up in terms of how does that fit into your state accountability system. This is already something that's reported for the Office of Civil Rights data collection. It's a measure that aligns with other improvement efforts that many states are undertaking and certainly are in Wisconsin. So we think it makes a lot of sense. Measuring family engagement, also something that's new, that's not really done very well. I shared that it would be important to measure participation at parent-teacher conferences. There are other surveys of family engagement that are currently done in our RTI initiatives around positive behavioral interventions and support, some really good family engagement questions that actually compare how a school measures and thinks they're doing with family engagement versus how a family thinks they're doing. And I think that can be very valuable information. It might be the only way to get at it is through satisfaction survey, but we know that those surveys have been developed in the PBIS world, and so that was a recommendation that I made. Unfortunately, we know that often parents with disabilities aren't invited to parent-teacher conferences with general education teachers and don't have those same opportunities. So their engagement in supporting their students' learning and success is really important, and parent-teacher conference is just one way to get at that. So again, we talked a lot about satisfaction surveys in terms of family engagement as a good tool. And so I'd urge you to look at what's happening in your state, where other family engagement sorts of surveys and parent satisfaction surveys exist, and can they be scaled up? Are they good enough? What questions could be added to them? Finally, when we were talking about school climate and safety, I made the big case that, of course, we should be including seclusion and restraint data, that's data that is part of the required civil rights data collection. It's something that we have a state statute on currently. Many states have their own state laws around seclusion and restraint, and we think that that's a really important measure that could be added and discussed here. We also have a youth risk behavior survey that gives a sense for students that have been experiencing bullying and harassment and violence on and off school grounds. So we think that those are really important measures that can get at how students feel about their school climate and safety. So again, you might have certain surveys or data collection efforts that are already happening in your school, within your state, and in order for it to be a valid measure, remember, it has to be able to be disaggregated by subgroup. It has to be statewide and able to be applied across all students, all schools. So look at what you have and see how it could be enhanced or added to apply for this accountability piece. So I guess, that was the input that I provided in trying to enhance the process for accountability for students with disabilities, and I hope that gives you a sense of how you can participate in your state.